the Centre for Law and Society at the University of Cape Town and the NRF Saatchi Chair in Security and Justice. The recording was part of a series of seminars entitled #Thought Leader Encounter, featuring leading and emerging academics on law and society in Africa. If you would like to find out more about the work of the Centre, please check out our website at www.cls.uct.ac.za or follow us on Facebook at CLSUCT or Twitter at CLSUCT. Happy listening. Good afternoon to you all. Just to reintroduce myself, my name is Gloria, and I'm one of the TAs helping with the Law and Society course that Prof. Smythe is running for some LLM students. But as part of that, we've collaborated with the Centre of Law and Society and have organized these lunchtime sessions where we kind of talk about things that are pertinent to the subject of law and society, or subjects as plural of law and society. And this afternoon, on our last afternoon of the what are they called? Thought Leader Encounters. We have invited Jameelah Omar, who is from our very own beloved faculty, and she is a criminal law lecturer. She also takes criminal law procedure and has done quite a bit of work on just criminal justice in general and law and protests. And we also have here Karim Ennarah, correct? Who is visiting from the American University in Cairo. He also works quite a bit in law and society in that region of the continent, and has done also extensive work on criminal justice as well as protests and the law. So we're very happy to have you, and Jameelah's going to be facilitating the conversation. We thank them very much for joining us today.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Gloria. It's a great privilege for me to join Karim here today to discuss the always relevant topic of protest and the use of force. Here in South Africa, we are, of course, familiar with use of force in the context of protest, but often far less knowledgeable about the same issue in other contexts in Africa. So it's really valuable to get some insight from someone who works closely on these issues in Egypt. Karim, to begin, just for those of us who might not know anything about law in Egypt, could you give us a very brief overview of the legal framework that governs protests and police use of force?
Thank you, Jameelah. And I want to start by saying that I'm very excited to be at UCT in Cape Town. It's my first time in Cape Town. I'm very grateful for CLS, for Dee and Jemima and Dan and the other people who facilitated my presence here. It's really interesting and exciting to be taking part in these conversations in the whole seminar and workshop, and to be listening to these conversations about South Africa and constantly drawing comparisons and lessons learned. Before I get to the heavy stuff, I just want to mention that in the previous presentation by Tsepo, we were talking about transitional justice and the TRC, and I was just reminded of something that was very interesting. In the immediate aftermath of the revolution in Egypt in January, some of you might know about it, January 25th, 2011, in the very first few months when idealism was quite high, and we were already thinking about security sector reform and transitional justice and institutional reform. Perhaps it was a bit too early to be thinking about these things, because the one thing we forgot to do, which is take power before we start talking about institutional reform, and so we're paying the price for that heavily now. But there was a rush of scholars and activists from a lot of places, and a lot of places in Africa who had a lot of experience with institutional reform and transitional justice, and obviously a lot of South African people, and we were very excited about that. There was a lot of South African people, scholars, activists, people who were involved in the ANC, lawyers, who were coming to Cairo and talking about the process as it happened in post-apartheid South Africa. And I remember the very first public lecture on such a thing that I went to was in March 2011. It must have been a month after Mubarak stepped down. And it was by the South African ambassador in Karim. She was giving the talk. And it was a very banal talk. It was, she spoke very, very emotionally about the amnesty process. I just have a memory of that, how she described it as this beautiful thing. And just didn't delve into a lot more detail after that. And it was a very interesting conversation followed, but at this point, most people, a lot of activists I know, a lot of revolutionaries, if you don't mind using that term, used to think of the process of security sector reform and transitional justice in South Africa as flowed and just that there wasn't enough, it didn't deliver. People had much more radical ideas about accountability and about police accountability in particular, and institutional change. This was in 2011, and it was a couple of years after that. When we look back at these times, we think, it would have been, if we could have gotten even a fraction of what you had in South Africa. I don't mean to belittle the kind of critique you guys were having this morning about it, but that would have been better than nothing, which is what we ended up with. But yeah, this is just a short note to start on. An important thing to mention is that the January 25th revolution, it's called that because the very first day of protest was January 25th, which was Police Day in Egypt. It was a national holiday in celebration of the police, and it dates back to an event of colonial resistance where the police basically took up arms against the British Army in Suez, and a lot of them were killed by the British Army. And so it became, it's an act of colonial resistance that was celebrated, but by the time we got to 2011, people didn't think of that aspect at all. Police, we were very much a police state. That is a controversial term, at least from a scholarly point of view, but we were a police state in the sense that the police institution in particular controlled most of political life in Egypt, and the heavy-handed tactics of policing were deployed in all walks of life, not just in governing protest and everything really. And now we're more of a military state, where the military is in control instead of the police. This is what we've managed to achieve after 5-6 years of mobilization. So that day was chosen the reason they chose that day is because the police and the anti-police sentiment was very central to the mobilization around the revolution. So that's something just to keep in mind. But now I'm going to go back to Jameelah's question. So it's very difficult, obviously, to give a brief history of the policing institution in Egypt and how it came, and the legal framework that governs it. And I don't want to talk too much about it all, because I was just having a conversation with Jameelah earlier. When I was thinking about this presentation, I wanted to talk about how police institutions become more or less violent, which is something that is of interest to us as legal scholars, socio-legal scholars, but also I also work in an NGO where I work in police reform and criminal justice policy. People who are interested in using the law as a tool for change. How do police institutions become more or less violent, with particular focus on policing protest? That's the example I'm going to use today. And there's a lot of factors. The law is only one of them. There's institution legacy, organization culture, and all of this is part of the political culture of the country, and power dynamics at different parts of political opportunities that present themselves in moments like the revolution, where the power dynamic is shifted a little bit, and you can change something, or maybe you fail. So there's a lot of factors, and the law and procedure is just one of these factors that govern how the police comport themselves, and how they use violence, and how they respond to protests, and the relationship with the public. Now, the policing institution in Egypt is quite old. And we, like many other policing institutions in the continent, we were heavily influenced by British colonial policing practice. So there's similarities with South Africa here. The key thing to think of is that while the British police, the British are, in policing literature, they're quite famous for establishing in 1829 the Metropolitan Police Force, and that model of policing, which came to be known today as policing by consent, differentiated itself from how policing, especially policing protests and crowds, happened in the rest of the European continent, in that it was a less militarized style. They had these bobbies with the civilian uniforms, and the weapons were not very visible. They didn't have any weapons, and it was supposed to be. There's a lot of critiques of policing by consent, but there's no space for me to delve into them. But the key thing I want to talk about is how this model of policing developed significantly in the UK and then in the rest of the democratic world, quote unquote, between 1829 and the mid-20th century. But at the same time, what the British were applying in the colonies was very much that, the style of policing that's associated with French policing or continental policing, which is very, where the police is organized like a military force, essentially. And they have a lot of assault weapons, and they respond with and they prioritize less issues of legitimacy and public perception. And this is what they use in the colonies, and that had a major impact on how policing institutions that a lot of these colonies inherited after independence from the UK. You can see traces of that in Egypt and South Africa and India, and it shaped how they evolved maybe until today. Now, Egypt is in that unfortunate... It's going to come back on this. Yeah, I'll keep talking, and if you guys can't hear me, you can't see me, but that's not a problem. But, yeah, it is very eerie. Egypt was in that unfortunate position where it was not one of these colonies where the British got to build the state from scratch. There were relatively modern state institutions in place, built by Muhammad Ali over the 19th century, and the British just played around with them a little bit. And they ruled institutions already existing, including the police institutions. But they still instilled these strategies and tactics of militarized policing that they applied, especially in response to public assemblies that they applied in India and in South Africa and in Palestine. There's a very famous debate about the use of tear gas, for instance, in the colonies. Tear gas is something that continues as a policing weapon, and I work a lot on police and less lethal weapons. Is something that is very controversial until today in the UK. They never use it in the UK, but it was first used and experimented with in Palestine and India and Zambia, I believe, and then later on in Egypt by the British, while debates were happening in the Parliament in London about whether they should do this or not, whether they should bring it here or not bring it here. And so it came to influence the shape of the organization structure. So what we're left with today, especially when it comes to the public order policing, we have in Egypt, we have something called the Central Security Forces, and they're a very militarized force, to the extent that they use conscripts from the army. That's a significant part of the Central Security Force, which is the first responder to public assemblies. Now, another thing that the British left us with was a couple of laws that govern assembly. The 1914 Assembly Law and the 1923 Assembly Law. We had these for 100 years, they were operational. They were not just colonial laws, but laws that were enacted in the context of the First World War, so an emergency, a national emergency declared by the British and Egyptian government. And then the 1923 Assembly Law is enacted in the context of the Egyptian 1919 revolution. That's something that actually, right now, March 2019 is the centennial of that breakout of the revolution. It was the first revolution against the British colonialists, and it lasted more or less, depending on how you define revolution, from 1919 until the enactment of the first Egyptian liberal constitution in 1923. But then the Assembly Law was passed, and they're both extremely restrictive laws, obviously. And I'm not going to delve into the details of these laws, but the main thing we take away from it is that they establish a concept that still exists in Egyptian criminal law, which is any assembly that is bigger than 5 persons is a potential threat to public safety, and the response in the law that the police are allowed to, the tools that the police are allowed to use to respond to these go up all the way to lethal force, based on an assembly of 5 people, more than 5 people, right? But these laws did not matter so much in 2011. In fact, most people were not conscious of the existence of these laws. Over the course of time, they became less relevant. And over the course of time, and especially during the period of Mubarak's rule, which lasted from 1981 until 2011, these were very quiet periods. They weren't massive national protests. There were obviously protests happening for socioeconomic protests. There were like land protests. There were a lot of small protests here and there. And the response would be violent, but you never heard about like big numbers of casualties. And very rarely were people prosecuted on the basis of these laws. And then I'm going to fast forward to to 2011.
Maybe just before you get there, Karim, so you said many people weren't aware of these laws until 2011.
Yeah.
But in your experience, were the police implementing these laws, or were they adopting some other kind of practice of policing protests?
These are laws that govern. Some prosecutors are implementing them. The police, in fact, what governs the actions of the police in the context of an assembly is not just assembly laws, because these are laws that regulate. They regulate also how the protest organizers, or in theory, they're supposed to regulate how protesters and citizens and protest organizers are supposed to go on at the process of having an assembly. Police is also governed, more importantly, by the Police Act. And especially when it comes to use of force and the tactics they employ during protest, all of that should be in the Police Act. Now, the Police Act in Egypt doesn't have any of this. It has reference to a couple of ministerial decrees. So it's not legislation that was discussed in Parliament. Not that would have made a difference in the history of the different parliamentary debates. But decrees, administrative decrees, and ministerial decrees, they govern the specifics of what kind of weapons they have, how to respond to protests, when to escalate lethal force. And obviously, throughout our history, these decrees, and they're still in existence, although I'll come to that later, the law that we had after the revolution changed that a little bit. They had the concepts, the very important concepts in policing literature of proportionality, legality of any police response. Legality, proportionality, necessity, precaution, and accountability, they don't exist in the law. So it very quickly escalates based on the discretion of the police officers to lethal force. So that's decrees that complement the Police Act, and then you've got the assembly laws. But we didn't have a very active protest culture. That's a controversial statement. I know a lot of union organizers who would throw things at me if they heard me say that, because obviously there were things happening all the time, but incomparable in magnitude and intensity to what happened after the revolution, because it was a complete reversal of that culture. During that period, if I may proceed to that, between 2011 and 2013, which for me is the period between when the revolution started and when proper consolidation of military power, you had coup and military power was consolidated over a period of a few months. That's the period where I would describe as the period of revolutionary mobilization. Again, controversial term. Some people think of the revolution as the 18 days until Mubarak sat down and then we started the process of constitutional reform and elections. Some people don't call it a revolution at all. Some snobbish scholars like to use the term uprising because revolution involves taking power, and we ended up not doing that. And some people, if you're one of, I have a lot of friends who are romantic revolutionary socialists who still think we're in a revolution, and it goes on until you achieve and it just goes on. It's a feminist revolution. But for convenience sake, I'll confine it to the period between 2011 and 2013. An important aspect of that is that the law didn't matter as much during these periods. It was purely street power and power dynamics. Now, I'll give you an example of this. When you think of a lot of cases of police use of force, and a lot of, and this period, I like to think of it as it's comparable for me to the period between, if I'm going to use Joe imagine South Africa between 1990 and 1994. That was the height of violence, when the protest movement had some upper hand in the negotiations, and there was a transition happening. But there was a lot of protest on the street, and there was a lot of extremely violent response by the police because the state was in existential threat mode. And again, the law didn't matter that much, in the sense that people didn't even, there was recourse to the law, obviously, NGOs and lawyers and community activists. But people went in thinking they were going to die and either win or lose. They didn't really think about a human rights approach to the protests of policing. So we have the biggest numbers of casualties during these 2 years, and they're quite big.
Can you just give us an indication?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. During the 18 days, the 18 days is when the revolution started until Mubarak stepped down and the military took over a transitional council, and then you have the constitutional process and all that. During these 18 days, there was protests all over the country. About the most conservative estimates is about 100 police stations were burned down, and courts were burned, and the police was responding with lethal fire because they were in existential defense mode. A government inquiry was established after that, and they estimated, it didn't lead to accountability or anything, but it was to look into the events of the 18 days. They estimated the number of casualties to be 849, okay? Now, people are not hung up on this figure at all compared to other incidents that happen afterwards, smaller incidents. And the reason is that this was, if you look at the footage, some of you might have seen it. It's not. I'm not going to display any of that, but it's all over the internet. The footage of the protest and the revolution on January 2011. It looks like one of these, these Delacroix paintings of the French Revolution. It's like complete lawlessness. People are taking over the streets. People are running over police stations, and so and people don't think of that in legal terms. It's an extra legal event by definition. That's how I like to see it. And what happened during that period. People maybe quickly got over it because of the fact that we won, So that's the main thing. This was a battle, and people thought, at least, or for a temporary period, that they overcame the police, and the police disappeared from the streets for weeks, and they were afraid to walk in the streets with in uniform. And the military came, and people had a fraught, tense, but better relationship with the military, and that's how the negotiated process started afterwards. Right, so that's one figure. Now, after that, there was a lot more protests happening every once in a while. So, for instance, November 2011, the Mohammed Mahmoud protest. That is a protest. People then had already started thinking about institutional reform, about new legislation, about there was a debate over bringing forward the election, moving the election, doing the constitution before election. I don't want to get bogged down in these details, but part of this political contestation would take part in the street. Some people would say that this was one of the failures of the social movements behind the revolutions, that they resorted to street politics so much, and we had less power than the two most resourceful forces, which is the military, the one that has the most resources, and the Muslim Brotherhood. Whereas, who were involved definitely, but who had different agendas. So, Mohammed Mahmoud protest, for instance, in November 2011, this was this lasted 6 days, and it was police used tear gas so heavy. About 45 people died from tear gas and from live ammunition and shotgun pellets, which is a weapon that is in the arsenal of Egyptian public order units, that's the Central Security Forces. And that's the figure that people were hung up on for a very long time. There was a process, a failed accountability process that started after this. Although one police officer got convicted. I can talk about that later. But I'm just giving you some examples of, and then he had a couple of more incidents where there were big protests and police responded with a lot of violence and tens of people died, up until 2013. The summer of 2013 was quite blood. Now, all of this was state violence, by the way. And there wasn't a situation where these movements were armed movements. When people talk about revolutionary violence, it's about Molotov cocktails, at most. Up until the summer of 2013, where there was a disintegration in the movement. There was you had an elected president that was overthrown by the military. There was the Islamist protests, there were the counter-protesters, and there was the police, and there started to be communal violence dynamics, and a lot of people were killed in communal and sectarian violence, and then there was the supporters of the president who was overthrown. They had this camp for 45 days, and the police and military moved in and brutally dispersed that. About 800 people died in that incident. That is a very important incident, because after that, this is when I would say over the period of 2013, 2015, consolidation of an authoritarian experiment in power that is unprecedented even in the context of Egypt. So this is what we end up with today. Public space is completely shut down. This was backed by a lot of people as well. So there are a lot of protests supporting the military. And I like to think of the June 30 protest, June 30, 2013, which was a massive, massive protest, as the people were protesting to end all protests. People didn't want to see any more. The people who took part in that protest, they didn't want to see any more protests. They were happy to hand over everything, including the political opening up of space that happened. Back to the military, take care of this. We're tired of this. So after that, public space shut down, and we don't have as much public protest happening in Egypt today between 2013 and anything that happens is responded to immediately with arrest, because usually it's small numbers, so they can arrest them. They don't even have to use a lot of force. But I'm going to talk about the last thing in the legal framework here, which is that in November 2013, so this is a new authoritarian government, and they're developing an arsenal of legislation that just helps them entrench their power, including a new protest law, the law number 107 for the year 2013. This is how we describe laws in Egypt. And that law is changed some things. It removed the colonial law of 1914. It retained the 1923 law for some reason, because it wanted that five-person assembly threat clause, introduced a little bit more restriction on how the police can use force. And introduced for the first time we had like a notification system, which is not really a notification system, it's an authorization system. And we had a lot of restrictions for the first time placed upon protest organizers. This is the law that we have today. And it's important because people are much more conscious of this law than they were of the 1913 and 1923 laws. Mind you, when protesters are arrested and they're criminally prosecuted by the state, they're usually prosecuted on the basis of this law, the 1923 law, but more importantly, usually, in every case of protest that I've worked on, that I'm familiar with, there's a host of other charges from the criminal code of damage to public property and like physical assault to police officers, things that will increase your prison sentence basically, because that protest law is not enough. And you know, they want to, people today, protesters, they get like 5-year sentence, 10-year sentence, easily, very easily, and a lot of them serve it.
That would be quite similar to the South African context, where the Regulation of Gatherings Act also stipulates a number of persons in which that act becomes effective then. And in South Africa it's 15, so 15 or more people is deemed a gathering in which the police can then use force when necessary. It does regulate it a bit more than that. And there's been a lot of controversy about the act generally. But I think you raise important points about how the focus on an act that regulates a protest is really only just one piece of that conversation. And actually, the real work to be done is on the institutions themselves and on the political space within which an act like that operates.
Yes.
So, you know, as social legal scholars, I suppose focusing on the minutiae of the law won't take you that much further. That's not where the interesting conversation is to be had.
Yeah, that's so. I mean, as I was saying, the protest law is only one part of the law that governs this equation, and the law itself is only one element in what governs this, like people's relation with the police and how police use violence sometimes care more about the legitimacy. And I'm gonna give a few more examples of this, of how like I'm going to try to move away from. But also one last thing actually on the 2013 law, I was reminded of something that Ennarah was saying yesterday in the presentation about law as a site of discourse and a law as a reflection of culture. And 2013 law is important not because of its details, but because it reflected, and it had a lot of public support. It reflected a public sentiment that didn't really care about details. They just wanted a law that bans protest, essentially. You know, very frequently I have conversations with people who are, you know, on the other side of the debate, and they will even cite it as the law banning protest. It's not called that, obviously. Legislators didn't give it that name. I mean, they use whatever tricks inside the law to make it extremely difficult to protest, but it's still named the Public Assembly Law, and it's meant to facilitate. I mean, they don't use the term facilitate, they use regulate and govern. But a lot of people think of it as that, and it's a reflection of that. And the Police Act use it as like a tool to ban all protest, even though there are restrictions, very few restrictions, but there are restrictions in the law on how the police can refuse. Again, it's not supposed to be a permit. You're supposed to like notify the police, but they use it as a permit, and they say no, this is not allowed. And whereas in the law they have to go to court. But in reality, what governs the work of the police in Egypt is like a lot of very complex power dynamics. And the fact that the state is so militarized and the police is so politicized, and an environment of almost absolute impunity. Now, why do I say almost? Because I'm going to get to the second part of this presentation where I talk a bit more about accountability. Now, we're interested in law as, I'm interested in legal reform and in law as a tool of change. And I believe that a very important aspect of institutional reform is accountability. So criminal accountability, but also just accountability on a much higher level. And I think this is probably relevant to, as different as the context is in South Africa to Egypt. And I work with some colleagues in civil society in South Africa as well who were involved in a lot of attempts to achieve accountability for things like Marikana, and we face similar challenges basically. How to achieve accountability in an environment that's not enabling, and where the norm is impunity, and the laws are not necessarily enabling, even when they're not necessarily implemented. Again, with the caveat that, I would say that South Africa has, at least in terms of recourse to courts, it's in a much better place than Egypt, especially Egypt today. But I'll give a few examples of that. I think wait. First of all, I'll give a few examples now. I work in an organization that does legal aid and human rights work and advocacy. And so I can't get into that language of like good practice and bad practice. And I work on police reform as well. Sometimes I talk and I sound like a police officer. And sometimes when you talk about police good practice, like, people just cringe, it's like, what is that? Does that even exist? But when you engage in like advocacy and stuff, you sometimes have to find it, But Egypt has a lot of, a huge repertoire of bad and extremely bad and horrible practices that can be used to, instruct. So I'm going to give you one example of that, and it's from 2015. So in a period where I would say, we started to be aware of the fact that we're living in an extremely authoritarian state, much worse than anything we had before the revolution. And I'll show you a video. It's not very graphic, but it's an interesting case because this is a case of public policing in response to an assembly, but it's not protest. It's in a football stadium. Now, I just have to give a very quick backgrounder on, football fans in Egypt have a very close relationship with the police. Some of you might be aware of an incident that happened in 2012 where, what we call the ultras groups of football fans who were also quite politicized and involved in the revolutionary mobilization. They had a standoff in the Port Said Stadium in a football game with other fans, and the police kind of allowed this standoff to happen, and there was a crush and 72 people died. This is the worst football stadium football disaster in the history of Egypt. After that, and fans were not allowed into stadiums for about a year. This was supposed to be an emergency measure. We still live with that emergency measure until today, but this is part of it's much larger discussion about how the current administration has just shut down public space. Now, football stadiums are a very important public space in Egypt. They're also a space for expressing dissent, but they serve other functions. They don't care. Completely shut down. In 2015, they conceded so much as we're going to experiment with allowing fans back in stadiums, because obviously they blamed this on the fans. And so there was a game. This was supposed to be a pilot game, where it's in a stadium. It's called the Air Defense Stadium because it's a military stadium out in the middle of nowhere. And this experiment was supposed to be 10,000 fans. Khalid Stadium used to hold like 120,000 fans for like most of its history, but this was just 10,000 fans. And they, this is the level of absence of accountability, the level of apathy for human life and human dignity that the plan they had for making sure that nothing goes wrong was that they built, it's not going to be very visible here on the plane, they built a barbed wire tunnel into the entrance to the stadium to make sure that everyone who enters goes through this tunnel, and so they're completely controlled, right? And that was obviously, you're setting yourself up for failure. And what happened is that very quickly, you will see here. Now this video is on Facebook. We were just having a conversation about how Facebook is a very political platform in Egypt. You won't find this video elsewhere. If you look it up on YouTube and newspapers, it's uploaded by one of the groups of the fans of this was a Zamalek game, and they mostly Zamalek fans at the time. I don't know if why we're on this topic. Zamalek is the second biggest team in Egypt, and some of you who are interested in football might know about it. And there's an urban myth that we hear all the time in Egypt, I don't know if it's true, that there's a beer called Zamalek in South Africa, and that it's called Zamalek because one time Zamalek